Good afternoon, everybody. I think I'm the last one, so I'll keep it short. My name is Pam Relph, as he said, and I am disabled. There's probably quite a few people here looking at me going, "Ooh, she doesn't look very disabled. Can't see anything wrong with her." And that's kind of what I'm here to talk to you about today. About 4 years ago, I went from being completely able-bodied to disabled practically overnight. But I wasn't in a horrible accident and I didn't suddenly get sick. Somebody told me that I had a disability and that I'd actually had it for over 10 years. When I was young, I was diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis, a condition which has left me with limited range of mobility in my wrist and hand. I have constant pain in joints across my body, but that was just my life. I struggled with things such as carrying shopping bags, so instead of carrying them like this, I would put them in the crook of my arm. When I'm training, I do press-ups on my knuckles instead of with my hands flat on the floor. I quite often get my nearest and dearest to open up jars for me, because I'm a bit lazy, but also because I'm not very strong. And there are always things that I can adapt to get around. It was just something that I thought I just had to deal with and get on with, and the pain is something I've just gotten used to alongside quite a strict medication regime, and that was just the way I went about doing my life. And I was of the impression that a lot of people are, that to be disabled, you have to have something really wrong with you. You have to be in a wheelchair, you've got to be missing a limb, or at the bare minimum, you've got to use a walking stick. And so there I was with my gammy wrist and my sore joints being told, "Oh, you're disabled. And more than this, that your disability allows you to participate in Paralympic sports." So as you can imagine, it came as a bit of a shock. I felt really guilty for quite a long time, and it took me a while to come to terms with it. I almost felt a bit like a fraud, like I was making a big deal out of something that I dealt with my entire life. And it was only when I stopped to think, well, how does this affect my life? And actually thought about all the things it did stop me from doing, all the ways it held me back, that I started to slowly come around to the idea that, you know what, yeah, I do have a disability. And not a moment too soon, because at that point in time, it was 18 months to go until London hosted the Olympics and Paralympics. So I chose a pretty good time to get involved in elite sport. I started training full time, whilst also finishing my degree here at the University of Birmingham. And before I knew it, I was selected as one of 4,000 athletes to compete at the London Paralympic Games. There was over 164 countries at the Paralympics, and it was the biggest one since the event began in 1960. And it was where I won this. I'm going to put it down because it's quite heavy. The world was introduced to the superhumans, and disability sport changed forever. It was as if a taboo surrounding disability just disappeared overnight. Channel 4 did some great coverage, and their classification guideline called Lexi, some of you might have seen it, which showed a small graphic pop up at the bottom of the screen, which showed the viewer where the disability in the athletes coming along in the next event was. And it's amazing when you think about where we've come from. In 1988, the coverage of the Paralympics extended to a quite patronising 40-minute programme broadcast a month after the event. Come 1996, the Atlanta Games, there were 3 40-minute highlights programmes, and unfortunately for our Olympic counterparts, the Atlanta Games was a very low point when the Olympic team brought home only 1 gold medal, in rowing, might I add, my sport. And the British Paralympic Association used this to garner support for the Paralympic team, saying we're going to go back to Atlanta and we're going to restore pride in Britain. So that saw daily coverage on shows like GMTV and other news programmes. And by 2004, the BBC were on board, and it saw the start of live broadcasting for Paralympic sports, which was the first time it had ever been done in our country. But it's only really in the last few years where we've seen an increase in disability shown across the board and not just for sport and success. The Last Leg, which was a TV show broadcast during the Paralympics, brought in over 1 million viewers per night, and it spoke about disability and made it okay to speak about disability. they had a section called "Is it okay to say?", which basically showed the viewers where the parameters lay on what you could actually say about disability, where was the levels. And we should be talking about it, because according to Scope, the leading disability charity in the UK, nearly 1 in 5 people in the UK has a disability. That's 20%, that's a lot of people. I think that the examples I've said already show a very small proportion of what is actually out there for disabled people, not just sportsmen and women. The most recent Creative Diversity Network survey showed only 2.5% of the television population, so 2.5% of every single character, news presenter, everybody on television depicts a disabled person. So you've got 2.5% of people on TV versus 20% of people in real life. There's a bit of a mismatch there, but that number is actually the highest it's ever been. So we're on the right path, and the prevalence of disability on our TV screens and in our magazines is on the increase. But I think one question we do need to ask ourselves is whether or not the media is massively narrowing our view of what disability actually is. You guys might know the TV series Breaking Bad. You've got a regular character on Breaking Bad, Walt Jr., he's disabled. You have Artie in Glee as a student at a school who's in a wheelchair. However, these very obvious disabilities are not proportional to the disabilities you see in everyday life. Less than 8% of disabled people in the UK use a wheelchair, and less than 0.1% of the whole of the UK population is an amputee. What we're seeing is a large amount of disabilities not being represented and not being recognised. There's many individuals with conditions that have a massive impact on their day-to-day life, but they might not readily be discernible to others. Conditions like chronic pain, chronic fatigue syndrome, arthritis, severe fibromyalgia, traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, seizures, epilepsy. To the naked eye, these people all appear normal. When a disability isn't immediately obvious, it can often place doubt onto whether or not it actually exists. And people with invisible disabilities like mine often face unheralded difficulties in the workplace and in their communities. I wonder whether or not it's that we feel more comfortable around disabled people when we know straight away, yep, that's what's wrong with them. Okay, I know how to deal with that. Whether or not it takes away some of the awkwardness when we're like, oh, I'm not 100% sure what this person can and can't do. Benevolent prejudice in favour of people with a very visible disability can create massive negativity towards people with invisible disabilities like mine. It's an attitude which leads to, for example, the general public feeling the need to stick up for and protect the vulnerable against benefit fraud. I have a friend who rightfully uses a blue badge parking disabled permit when he's a passenger in a car because he has a visual impairment. He says he regularly gets harassed by passers-by who don't know him because, according to them, there is nothing wrong with him. Now, this guy can't see 5 feet in front of his face, so walking through a busy car park in the middle of the day is probably not a good idea, and yet the general public are absolutely outraged at the idea that a 20-something fit young guy with nothing wrong with them can have the cheek to use a parking space reserved for somebody who is really disabled. And why shouldn't they? We've been programmed to be under the idea that this iconic image of a stick man sat in a wheelchair, which is painted onto almost every accessible bay, that's what disability is. We've created a disability hierarchy where disabilities like mine and other invisible disabilities are ranked right at the bottom, just like it's a little niggle. Get on with it. And I think that we've come to the point now where we need to use more than our eyes to judge people. I myself have been on the receiving end of this kind of attitude. After London, there was a victory parade going around the streets of London, and to this date, it's still one of my most favoured memories of London. It was Olympians and Paralympians together, one team celebrating the entire team. And after the fact, I found out that there were some posts on a forum absolutely outraged at the idea that me and my crew were able to join in this because, again, according to them, there's nothing wrong with us. The media's contributed to disability having two categories. You have triumph over adversity and you have benefits frauds. And yes, these two do exist, but there's a whole road less travelled in between them. Who doesn't like a hero who overcomes incredible odds to achieve something spectacular? We can't assume, however, that everybody with a disability is like this. Disabled people reserve their right not to climb Everest and not to train every day to be a full-time athlete, and that's okay. And on the other hand, you have people in wheelchairs people who use wheelchairs regularly who are actually able to walk some of the time. People with disabilities of all ranges use mobility aids as and when they need them. So next time you see somebody in a wheelchair stand up to get into their car, try to avoid either screaming, "Hallelujah, it's a miracle," or grabbing your pitchfork. We've already come so far along this road of acceptance and equality for disabled people, but we've still got a really long way to go. A staggering 2/3 of the British public surveyed said that they felt uncomfortable talking to disabled people for fear of being patronising or saying the wrong thing. We're not that scary, I can guarantee it. Disabled people are just people, whether they need a full-time carer or are fully independent, whether they can walk, run, sing, dance, row, whether they look disabled or whether or not they look like there's nothing wrong with them. Nearly 20% of people in this country have a disability, the majority of which you won't even know about. When you're walking out of this room, instead of just looking with your eyes, try opening up your ears and your mouth and start a conversation, and consider the idea that disability is more than skin deep. Thank you.